Britney Cole wasn't kidnapped. That would have been easier to understand. Instead, she watched her own stepmother shake hands with the most feared billionaire in America, and realized they were negotiating her. Not a house. Not land. Not a business. By the time Britney tried to speak, the contract had already been signed. The money had already changed hands. And the woman who used to call her sweetheart looked her in the eyes and said, "Go with him." No one argued. No one tried to stop it. Because the man waiting outside wasn't just rich. People crossed the street to avoid saying his name out loud. Luke Ritchie. The billionaire every newspaper called Ruthless. The man whispered to have destroyed families, built empires, and buried enemies without leaving fingerprints. Everyone standing outside the Cole estate believed Britney's life had just ended. They were wrong. Because the most dangerous person in this story was never the billionaire who bought her. It was the woman who sold her. And before this story is over, one family secret will destroy a fortune. One lie buried for decades will finally come to light. And the girl everyone believed had just become a billionaire's prisoner will discover she was the one person Luke Ritchie had been searching for all along. But before we uncover why one of the most feared billionaires in America would spend a fortune on a girl he had never met, take just 2 seconds to subscribe, like this video, and turn on notifications. Because on this channel, every story reminds us that betrayal never has the final word. Hidden truths always come to light, and the people everyone counts out often deliver the most unforgettable comeback. Now, let me show you the moment Britney Cole's entire life changed forever. The price on Britney Cole's life wasn't written on paper. It had been spoken over her late father's dining table, in the calm voice of a woman who had spent 4 years pretending to be her mother. Vanessa Cole never needed to threaten Britney. She had already taken everything else. 4 years earlier, Britney's father had collapsed behind his desk, his heart stopping without warning. In a single afternoon, the home that had once echoed with warmth became a prison disguised as a family estate. The inheritance her father had spent a lifetime building slowly disappeared into Vanessa's failed investments, reckless gambling, and expensive companions. And when the money ran out, Vanessa found something else to use as collateral. Britney. She'd remember that afternoon for the rest of her life. Not because of the fear. The fear came later. What stayed with her was the cold bite of the cobblestones cutting through the thin fabric of her dress as her knees hit the ground, and the strange gentleness of Vanessa's hand resting on her shoulder, soft enough for the watching men to mistake it for affection. Only Britney knew better. That hand had never offered comfort. Only control. 3 men in perfectly tailored black suits stood beside a waiting SUV, their expressions hidden behind mirrored sunglasses. A 4th carried a black briefcase as though it contained something far more dangerous than money. And standing silently at the center of them all, arms folded, was Luke Ritchie. He didn't bark orders. He didn't smile. He simply watched Britney with unreadable eyes, as though he already knew something about her that she didn't know herself. Vanessa forced a desperate smile. "She's a hard worker, Mr. Ritchie. Cooks, cleans, never complains. She'll do whatever's needed to settle what I owe you." Every word felt like another shovel of dirt being thrown onto Britney's grave. Luke never looked at Vanessa. His eyes remained fixed on Britney. On the young woman kneeling on the stone with scraped palms and trembling hands. "Bring Miss Cole with us," he said. Not a question. Not even directed at her. That was it. No explanation. No mercy. Just 5 words that ended one life and began another. Finally, he spoke. "Bring Miss Cole with us." 5 simple words. No anger. No explanation. No negotiation. Just 5 words that ended one life and began another. As the SUV pulled away from the only home she'd ever known, Britney kept waiting for the monster the newspapers had spent years describing. The silence inside the vehicle was almost unbearable. Then Luke glanced briefly toward her bleeding hands. His expression didn't change. Neither did his voice. "You're bleeding." Britney gave a hollow laugh. "I can pay for the cleaning once I figure out how much I'm worth." For the first time, something flickered across Luke Ritchie's face. Not amusement. Not pity. Something else. Something Britney couldn't understand. Outside the tinted windows, the city disappeared behind them. With every passing mile, she became less certain she was being taken to her execution, and more certain she was being taken toward a truth someone had spent years making sure she would never discover. The estate, when they reached it, wasn't the fortress of horror she'd braced for. Marble floors, hushed staff, air that smelled faintly of cedar instead of fear. Luke led her down a long corridor himself, stopping at a door. "This is yours," he said. "Dinner is at 7. No one in this house will ever raise a hand against you." Britney stared at him, waiting for the catch. The cruelty she'd been promised her entire life would be coming. It never came. "I don't understand," she whispered. "Why bring me here at all if not to?" "You're free to leave tomorrow," Luke said quietly, already turning away. "But first, there's something you deserve to know about your stepmother. Something that has nothing to do with the money she thinks she owes me." He left her standing alone in a room with clean sheets and a locked door she didn't need to fear, and for the first time in 4 years, Britney Cole didn't know whether to feel like a prisoner, or like she'd just been rescued from one. Britney didn't sleep. She sat on the edge of the enormous bed for what felt like hours, still in her ruined dress, waiting for the house to reveal its true face. She'd heard the stories, everyone had. Luke Ritchie made rivals disappear. Luke Ritchie owned judges and senators the way other men owned watches. She'd been so certain she was walking into a cage that the silence of the room felt like a trick, a held breath before something worse. But nothing came. No footsteps in the night. No one testing the door. When morning light finally cut through the curtains, she made herself stand, made herself look around the space properly for the first time. A walk-in closet stood open, lined with clothes in her exact size. Soft sweaters, tailored slacks, nothing flashy, nothing that felt like a costume for whatever role she was expected to play. A note sat folded on the dresser. "A doctor will see you at 9. Ask Olivia for anything you need." She didn't understand any of it. Downstairs, the estate revealed itself in pieces. Security men stood at every entrance, disciplined and utterly silent, their eyes tracking movement without ever meeting hers. Staff moved through the halls with the quiet precision of people who had learned, the hard way, that mistakes here had consequences. Nobody spoke above a murmur. Nobody looked directly at Luke when he passed. It was, Britney realized, a house built entirely on fear, except somehow none of it had been pointed at her. The doctor examined her hands, her exhaustion, the fading bruises Vanessa had never bothered to explain away. He worked in silence, gentle in a way that made Britney's throat tighten. Nobody had checked on her like this since her father died. She found Luke that afternoon in a study lined with books that looked read rather than displayed. He didn't glance up immediately. "Why does everyone in this house look like they're afraid to breathe?" she asked before she could stop herself. "Because they've seen what happens when people underestimate me," Luke said, finally meeting her eyes. "You haven't yet. That's the only difference. So what am I supposed to be afraid of?" He was quiet for a moment, studying her the way he had in the rain, assessing, weighing. "Nothing if I've done this right." Britney folded her arms, unwilling to let the strange gentleness of the last 12 hours erase 4 years of learning not to trust kindness. "Vanessa said she owed you money. That I was paying." "Your stepmother," Luke said carefully, "hasn't been paying a debt to me in years. She's been under investigation. Fraud, forged signatures, funds stolen from a children's charity that used her name to look respectable. I've been building that case for 18 months. He paused, letting the words settle. "The debt she offered you against was never real, Britney. I let her believe it was." The floor seemed to tilt beneath her. "Then why take me at all?" "Because if I'd arrested her that night, you'd have gone straight into the system or straight back into that house with no one watching. I couldn't let either happen." His voice didn't soften exactly, but something in it steadied. "You weren't purchased. You were removed from something that was going to destroy you eventually." Britney sat down slowly, the room tilting around a truth she didn't have language for yet. "You could have told me that last night." "I could have," Luke agreed. "You wouldn't have believed me." She almost laughed, a short, disbelieving breath. "I'm not sure I believe you now." "You don't have to." He rose, straightening his jacket, the conversation closing the way a door does, quietly but with finality. "You are free to leave tomorrow if that's what you want. No one will stop you." He paused at the threshold and for the first time, something almost hesitant crossed his face. "But first, there's something you deserve to know about your stepmother. Something I haven't told you yet." Britney's pulse climbed into her throat. "What haven't you told me?" Luke didn't answer. He only held the door open, waiting for her to decide whether she wanted to know the rest. Britney followed him back into the study, some part of her already bracing for whatever came next. She'd learned that lesson early. The worst news always arrived quietly in rooms that looked exactly like this one. Luke didn't sit this time. He stood by the window, hands clasped behind his back, and told her everything. Vanessa hadn't simply mismanaged money. She had forged Britney's late father's signature on documents transferring ownership of properties that were never legally hers to sell. She had funneled donations from a children's charity, one that used the Cole family name in its literature, into private accounts, then gambled most of it away in a single reckless year. Luke's team had spent nearly 2 years tracing the paper trail, waiting for enough evidence to make an arrest that would actually hold. She used your father's memory to steal from sick kids, Luke said, and then she used you to try to erase the evidence. Britney sat very still, her hands pressed flat against her knees. 4 years of scraping in silence, and none of it had been about grief or discipline at all. It had been about hiding a crime in plain sight, with her as the unpaid, unquestioning cover story. I don't know what to do with any of this, she admitted. You don't have to decide tonight, Luke said. Tonight you're coming with me to a gala. Consider it a distraction. The Ashford Foundation Gala filled Luke's ballroom-sized reception hall with silk gowns, string quartets, and enough diamonds to fund a small country. Britney stood at the edge of it in a dress Olivia had chosen for her, feeling like an imposter among people who had never scrubbed a floor in their lives. She was watching Luke work the room, measured, unreadable, exactly the man the headlines described, when the first shot rang out. The chandelier above the dance floor exploded in a shower of glass. Screaming erupted instantly, guests scattering toward exits that security had already sealed. Britney froze for half a second before instinct took over, dropping her to the floor behind an overturned table. Through the chaos she saw him. 2 men in caterers' uniforms had pulled weapons from beneath serving trays, and one had a clear line on a young waiter frozen near the bar. An employee, not a target, just a boy who'd wandered into the wrong sightline. Luke moved before Britney could process what she was seeing, throwing himself between the gunman and the boy. The shot that followed sounded smaller than she expected. Almost ordinary. Luke went down hard against the marble, blood already spreading beneath him in a widening dark stain. Security swarmed the shooters within seconds, but the room had already dissolved into panic. Screaming, shoving, no one thinking clearly enough to help. Britney didn't remember deciding to move. She was on her knees beside him before she'd finished the thought, her hands finding the wound at his shoulder with a steadiness that surprised her. This was the language her body had learned 3 years ago, kneeling on a different floor beside a different dying man. Her father, in his last agonizing hour, when the ambulance took too long and she'd been the only one who knew what to do. She pressed her palms hard against the wound, using the tablecloth someone shoved into her hands to slow the bleeding, counting his pulse under her fingers the way she'd once counted her father's. Stay with me, she said low and fierce. You don't get to die on my first week of freedom. By the time the paramedics finally broke through the chaos, Luke's breathing had steadied. Barely. But steadied. He woke hours later in a private hospital wing, Britney asleep in the chair beside his bed, still wearing the blood-streaked gown from the gala. When his eyes opened, he watched her for a long moment before speaking. You should be resting, he said, his voice rough with pain and disuse. Britney startled awake, her hand instinctively checking his pulse again before her brain caught up. You're alive. Because of you. Something shifted in his expression, not the careful blankness she'd come to expect, but something warmer, unguarded. He smiled. It was small and clearly unfamiliar territory for his face, but it was real. Thank you, Britney. She didn't know what to say to that, so she said nothing at all. 2 days later, once he could sit upright without wincing, Luke handed her a thick folder stamped confidential across the front. I need someone I can trust, he said quietly. I think that's you. The folder became a habit before Britney fully realized it. What started as reading company reports aloud to Luke while he recovered, his shoulder still too stiff to hold a tablet for long, turned into something else entirely once she noticed the numbers didn't add up. She wasn't an accountant. She'd never claimed to be. But 4 years of stretching Vanessa's grocery budget until it screamed had taught her how to read a ledger the way other people read faces, for the small tell that meant something was being hidden. A vendor invoiced twice in the same quarter for services no one could name. A logistics subsidiary that seemed to exist only on paper. Payments routed to a shipping company with no ships. She flagged the first inconsistency to Luke almost apologetically, certain she was misreading something a real analyst would have caught months ago. Luke didn't dismiss her. He leaned forward, wincing at the pull in his shoulder, and asked her to show him exactly where she'd found it. She did more than show him. Over the following 2 weeks, working quietly in the study while the rest of the house assumed she was simply keeping Luke company, Britney traced the thread further than either of them expected. Shell companies registered in 3 different states, all linked to the same unlisted address. Invoices for consulting work that matched no calendar, no meeting, no deliverable. Offshore transfers timed suspiciously close to major shareholder votes. This isn't sloppy bookkeeping, she told him, spreading the printouts across his desk. Someone is bleeding your company on purpose. Luke studied the pages in silence for a long moment. Then he did something that surprised her more than the shooting had. He called an executive meeting and put her name on the agenda. Special Strategic Advisor. The title sounded absurd even as Luke said it aloud to a boardroom of men and women who had built careers Britney couldn't have imagined a year ago. She felt every eye in the room measure her, weigh her, and land on the same conclusion. She heard the whispers before the door had fully closed behind her. The girl he bought off her stepmother. Someone's assistant snorted into her coffee. A senior VP didn't bother lowering his voice at all. Is this a joke? She's 23 and she's never worked a real job in her life. Britney kept her spine straight the way Luke had unconsciously taught her to over these past weeks. Not through instruction but through example. He never raised his voice in these rooms. He never needed to. Power she was learning wasn't loud. It was simply immovable. She found what 4 departments missed in 18 months, Luke said flatly, ending the murmuring with 5 words. That earns her a seat. It didn't earn her their respect. Not yet. But it earned her the room's silence, which Britney was beginning to understand was worth just as much. In the weeks that followed, Luke made time for her in ways she hadn't expected from a man notorious for having none to spare. He walked her through negotiation tactics before board calls, dissecting the psychology of every executive she'd face. He taught her to let silence do the work fear usually did, to ask a question and simply wait, refusing to fill the space herself. You don't have to be the loudest person in the room, he told her once, late at night over cold coffee and spreadsheets. You have to be the one who's still standing when everyone else runs out of things to say. Slowly, something Vanessa had spent 4 years grinding out of her began to return. Britney caught herself, for the first time in longer than she could remember, believing she might actually be good at something. Not surviving, building. She threw herself into the shell company thread with new determination, cross-referencing signatures against approval dates, working late into the night long after Luke had gone to bed. That was how she found it, buried 3 layers deep in a subsidiary's year-end filing, a signature that didn't match, a set of numbers that had been quietly altered after the fact. Britney sat back in her chair, her pulse climbing. The CFO, David's closest ally on the executive floor, had falsified financial statements worth hundreds of millions of dollars, and dated the changes to look as though they'd always been there. The boardroom was already half full of smirks by the time Britney walked in, a slim folder tucked under her arm like it weighed nothing at all, though her pulse hadn't slowed since the night before. Careful, one of the VPs murmured to another, not quietly enough. Wouldn't want her to break a nail opening that. A ripple of laughter moved down the table. Britney didn't flinch. She'd spent 4 years absorbing worse from Vanessa without so much as a blink, and these people, for all their tailored suits and corner offices, had nothing on a woman who'd once thrown a plate at her head for undercooked rice. Luke sat at the head of the table, unreadable as always, and gave her the floor with a single nod. Britney opened the folder. She walked them through it methodically, the shell companies with no employees, the invoices for consulting work that matched no calendar entry anywhere in the company's systems, the offshore transfers clustered suspiciously around 3 separate shareholder votes. She named names. She named the CFO specifically, laying his forged signature beside the original, the discrepancy obvious even from the back of the room. This isn't a bookkeeping error, she said, her voice steady even as her hands trembled slightly beneath the table. This is embezzlement, bribery of at least 2 board members whose voting patterns changed within days of receiving unexplained payments, and insider trading time to those same votes. All of it totaling somewhere north of $300 million. The laughter died somewhere in the middle of her second sentence. By the time she finished, the room had gone utterly silent. The kind of silence Britney had learned in this house meant something had shifted permanently. The CFO's face had drained of color. Several executives wouldn't meet her eyes at all. Every person at that table turned instinctively to Luke, waiting for the correction, the defense of his own people, the reminder that a 23-year-old with no formal training had clearly misunderstood something far above her. Instead, Luke rose slowly from his chair. From today forward, he said, his voice carrying without effort into every corner of the room, Britney speaks with my authority. No one breathed. Afterward, in the quiet of his study, Britney finally let herself exhale. They're going to hate me for that. They already hated you, Luke said. Now they'll respect you whether they like it or not. Something in his tone made her go still. You already knew, didn't you? About the CFO. About all of it. He didn't deny it. I've suspected for 8 months. I had the resources to expose it myself at any point. Then why let me walk in there and do it? The realization landed slowly, and it burned worse than she expected. You used me. That meeting wasn't about exposing him. It was about testing whether I'd actually go through with it, whether I'd choose honesty over staying safe and quiet. Yes, Luke said simply, offering no cushioning, no apology dressed up as explanation. Britney felt something in her chest crack open, not quite anger, something closer to grief for the trust she'd let herself build brick by brick over these past weeks. I thought this was real. I thought you actually believed in me. I did. I do. His voice, for once, lost its usual composure. But I've spent my entire life being betrayed by people I trusted first and tested second. I couldn't risk it the other way around. Not with you. She stood, suddenly needing distance, needing air that didn't smell like his cedar and gun oil and quiet, careful lies. Maybe I should leave tomorrow like you said I could. Luke didn't move to stop her. He simply watched her from across the room, something raw and unguarded finally breaking through the calculated stillness he wore like armor. You're the first person who has ever seen me as more than a monster, he said quietly. I wasn't ready to lose that. I'm still not. Britney meant to leave that night. She'd even gone as far as folding the borrowed clothes into a neat pile on the bed, unwilling to walk away with anything she hadn't earned. But when she came downstairs to tell Luke she was going, she found him in the study, 2 glasses of wine already poured, as though he'd known she'd stop there first. He didn't ask her to stay. He simply asked her to sit. You should know who you'd be walking away from, he said. Not the man the papers write about. The other one. He told her about a boy who'd grown up in a house with no heat some winters, a father who drank away whatever the family had, and a mother who worked 2 jobs and still couldn't make the math come out even. He told her about the first business partner he'd ever trusted, a man who'd cleaned out their shared accounts and vanished the same week Luke's mother died, leaving him 22 years old and entirely alone with nothing but debt and a lesson he'd never forget. I built everything after that on one rule, Luke said. Trust nothing you haven't tested. Fear is efficient. People don't lie to you when they're afraid of what happens if they do. That sounds like a lonely way to live, Britney said quietly. It was. He looked at her, and for once there was nothing calculated in it. Until you. Something in her chest loosened, the anger she'd been carrying since the boardroom finally settling into something gentler. She understood him now, not forgiven entirely, not yet, but understood. A boy who'd learned that trust was a currency too dangerous to spend carelessly had grown into a man who tested everyone because the alternative had once cost him everything. She didn't leave that night. The weeks that followed felt like borrowed time neither of them mentioned out loud. Dinners stopped being formal, 7 o'clock affairs conducted in silence, and became something closer to conversation. Luke asking about her father, actually listening when she talked about the small things, the ordinary years before grief and Vanessa had swallowed them whole. Britney found herself laughing more than she had in 4 years, surprised each time by the sound of it, like rediscovering a language she'd assumed she'd forgotten. Luke laughed too, rarely and quietly, but it was real. She caught him once, unguarded, smiling at something so small, a joke about his own terrible taste in ties, that she almost didn't recognize him. This was a man who had spent his entire adult life being feared. She wondered if anyone besides her had ever simply enjoyed his company. One evening, on the terrace overlooking the dark water, the conversation drifted into a comfortable silence neither of them rushed to fill. Luke reached over and tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, his hand lingering against her cheek longer than necessary. Britney, he said, low and unsure in a way she'd never heard from him. She didn't answer with words. She simply didn't move away. He kissed her slowly, carefully, like a man handling something he was terrified of breaking. And Britney, who had spent 4 years believing gentleness was something that happened to other people, leaned into it instead of flinching. For the first time in longer than either of them could remember, the house felt like something other than a fortress. It felt, briefly, like peace. The moment shattered 2 mornings later. Marcus Hale found Luke in his study before breakfast. His usual composure cracked into something close to alarm. He set a tablet down on the desk, a string of encrypted messages glowing on the screen. These came off a server we monitor, Marcus said grimly. Someone inside the company has been feeding information to Arthur Kane for months. Financial projections, security protocols, even personal schedules. Luke's expression hardened back into the man Britney had first met in the rain. Do we know who? Marcus hesitated, glancing briefly toward the door before answering. Not yet. But whoever it is has access to almost everything you have, Luke. Including her. It began before anyone could name the mole. By mid-morning, the company's stock had dropped 11% on rumors no one could trace to a source. By noon, 3 major news outlets ran simultaneous stories alleging fraud within Luke's holding company, each citing internal documents that Britney recognized instantly as pages from her own confidential files. By early afternoon, federal investigators had opened inquiries based on tips that could only have come from someone inside the walls of the estate itself. This isn't random, Britney said, watching the servers flicker with intrusion attempts on the monitors in Luke's study. This is coordinated. Someone gave Arthur Kane a roadmap. Marcus burst through the door before Luke could respond, his face grim in a way Britney had never seen from the unshakable head of security. Perimeters compromised. We've got armed men approaching the north gate, and our internal comms just went dark. Cut the servers before Arthur pulls anything else, Luke ordered, already moving toward the door. That's not going to be enough, Britney said, her mind racing faster than her fear could catch up to it. If someone inside fed him our security protocols, cutting the servers won't stop him. We need to isolate everything, financial, communications, security, right now before he can pull the trigger on whatever's left. Luke turned to look at her, and in his eyes she saw something she'd never expected from him. Uncertainty. Do it, he said. Gunfire erupted somewhere near the front of the estate before she'd even reached the terminal. Britney moved faster than she thought herself capable of, locking down the financial servers first, rerouting critical accounts through backup channels Luke's team had built for exactly this scenario but never expected to use. She cross-referenced access logs against the leaked documents, narrowing the list of people with clearance to the exact files that had been stolen. One name kept surfacing over and over in every log she pulled. David Mercer. Luke's closest advisor, the man who'd sat beside him through board meetings and quiet dinners for over a decade, had been feeding Arthur Kane everything: financial projections, security layouts, even the private schedule that had put Luke in a hospital bed months earlier. David's the mole, Britney said into the radio, her voice steady despite her shaking hands. He's had access to everything. Marcus, lock him out of every system now. Outside, chaos had erupted in full. Armed men pressed against the estate's perimeter, security holding the line but barely, communications reduced to whatever Britney could relay manually between disconnected teams. Luke was trapped in the East Wing, cut off from his own command center, unable to reach anyone. Britney didn't wait for him. She coordinated Marcus's remaining team through the compromised comms, redirecting them to cut off the exact access points David's stolen information had exposed. She flagged the fraudulent transactions Arthur's people were attempting to push through in the confusion and froze every account before a single dollar could move. She fed federal investigators the evidence she'd already assembled weeks earlier, time-stamped, verified, undeniable, proof that the internal documents leaking to the press had been altered, and that David Mercer was the source. By the time backup security forces breached the north gate from outside, Arthur Kane's coordinated assault had already collapsed under its own weight. The cyber attack contained, the stock manipulation exposed as fraud in real time, the media narrative reversed within hours by evidence Britney had handed directly to 2 of the reporters who'd run the original stories. Federal agents arrived within the hour and arrested David Mercer in his own office, his laptop still open to an encrypted channel connected directly to Arthur Kane. It was nearly midnight before the estate fell quiet again. Luke found Britney still at the terminal, exhausted, her hands finally steady now that the systems had stabilized. You didn't wait for me, he said. There wasn't time to. He studied her for a long moment, something shifting behind his eyes that she couldn't quite name. Everyone who has ever tried to protect what I built did it by standing behind me. He shook his head slowly, as though only now understanding the shape of what had happened. You didn't protect my company tonight, Britney. Then what did I do? You saved my legacy. Months passed before the dust of the siege fully settled. Arthur Kane's empire crumbled under the weight of federal charges and the very fraud he tried to pin on Luke, his allies scattering the moment his protection stopped meaning anything. David Mercer's trial made headlines for weeks, a cautionary tale whispered through every boardroom Britney now walked into with her head held high. Luke spent those months rebuilding, not just the security infrastructure Arthur's attack had exposed, but the entire architecture of who held power inside his company and why. I want to restructure the holding company, he told Britney one evening, spreading blueprints of an organizational chart across his desk instead of the property maps she'd expected. Fewer single points of failure. More people who've actually proven they deserve trust. She scanned the chart, her eyes catching on a title at the very top of the executive tier. Chief Executive Officer Richie Holdings. Her own name typed beneath it. Luke? You built the systems that survived the attack no one else saw coming, he said before she could argue herself out of it. You exposed corruption 3 departments missed for over a year. You ran command from a study while gunfire hit the perimeter, and you didn't flinch once. He met her eyes. The board already voted unanimously once they understood what actually happened that night. The same executives who'd laughed at her a year earlier now stood when she entered a room. The same senior VP who'd questioned whether she'd ever held a real job now reported directly to her, his objections long buried under the evidence of what she'd accomplished. Power, Britney was learning, didn't apologize for itself. It simply arrived, undeniable, and waited for everyone else to catch up. He proposed on the terrace where he'd first kissed her, the water below dark and endless, no ring box in sight, no elaborate staging. I don't have a speech prepared, Luke admitted, which was in itself unlike him. I've spent my whole life building things I could control completely. You're the first thing, the first person, I've never been able to control, and it's the only part of my life that's ever actually worked. He took her hands, his grip steadier than his voice. I don't need someone to stand behind me, Britney. I spent years surrounded by people who did exactly that, and it nearly cost me everything. I need someone willing to stand beside me. Someone Arthur Kane's whole network couldn't touch, because she was already stronger than the empire itself. Is that a proposal or a performance review? Britney asked, though her eyes were already burning. Both, Luke said, the ghost of a smile finally breaking through. Marry me. She didn't need 3 years to consider it, the way she once needed 3 years just to survive a single house. Yes, she said, and meant it more completely than she'd meant anything in her life. The wedding was small by the standards of a man whose name filled headlines. A private ceremony on the estate grounds, string lights woven through the same terrace where he'd asked her, close friends and the staff who'd quietly watched Britney's transformation from frightened girl to the woman standing at the altar in white. Olivia cried through the entire vows. Marcus, stationed discreetly near the perimeter even on his boss's wedding day, allowed himself a rare smile. America watched anyway. Photographers hovered beyond the gates. News anchors debated whether the most feared man in the country had finally been tamed, or whether he'd simply found someone equally formidable to stand beside him. Britney didn't care which version they told. She knew the truth, that she hadn't been rescued or tamed or claimed. She'd built her way into a life no one could take from her again. They were still dancing under the string lights when Olivia approached quietly, her phone screen glowing in the dark, her expression carefully neutral in the way Britney had learned meant bad news for someone. You should see this, Olivia said, turning the screen toward her. A news alert filled the display, stark against the dark garden. Vanessa Cole's financial empire collapses amid fraud charges. Property seized, assets frozen. Britney read it twice before the words fully settled. Vanessa had lost everything. The collapse, once it started, moved faster than even Britney expected. The fraud investigation Luke had built years earlier finally reached its conclusion, and every property Vanessa had claimed in the wake of Britney's father's death was seized within weeks. Her bank accounts were frozen. The friends who'd filled her social calendar for years evaporated the moment her name started appearing in headlines instead of society pages. Chloe stopped answering her calls entirely, according to the reports, abandoning her mother the same way Vanessa had once abandoned Britney, without so much as a backward glance. Criminal charges followed. Forgery. Embezzlement. Theft from a children's charity that had used the Cole name to seem trustworthy. The woman who'd once ruled Britney's childhood home with cruelty dressed as discipline now faced the very real possibility of years behind bars. Britney didn't feel triumphant when she read the news. She felt, mostly, a strange and distant quiet, the sound of a debt finally being settled, though not the one Vanessa had ever pretended to owe. She wasn't expecting Vanessa to show up at the gates herself. Security called up to the main house on a gray Tuesday afternoon, Marcus's voice clipped and careful over the intercom. Mrs. Ritchie, there's a woman at the front gate asking for you. Says her name is Vanessa Cole. Britney's hand tightened around her coffee cup. Beside her, Luke set down the report he'd been reading, watching her face carefully, saying nothing. Let her in, Britney said finally. Just her. Vanessa looked smaller than Britney remembered, not physically but in some essential way, as though the confidence she'd worn like armor for years had finally cracked under the weight of everything she'd lost. Her clothes were plain, unremarkable, nothing like the designer wardrobe Britney's father's money had once funded. She crossed the marble foyer and, before Britney could speak, dropped to her knees. "Please," Vanessa said, her voice breaking. "I have nothing left. No money, no home, no one. You're the only person who could possibly—" She was crying now, the tears streaking through carefully applied makeup that couldn't quite hide how much she'd aged. "I know what I did. I know I don't deserve it, but you're a good person, Britney, you always were, and I'm begging you." For a moment, Britney was 15 again, wiping blood from a split lip after a slap she hadn't seen coming, dressed as punishment for a chore done wrong. She was 17, scrubbing floors until her knuckles cracked, forbidden from crying because Vanessa said tears were for people who mattered. She was 20, kneeling on wet cobblestones, sold to a stranger like an object that had finally outlived its usefulness. Luke stood a few feet away, silent, his hands loosely at his sides. He didn't move to intervene. He didn't need to say a word for Britney to understand this decision belonged entirely to her. She looked down at the woman who had once owned every hour of her life, and felt something settle inside her. Not hatred, not even anger anymore, just a clear and unshakable certainty. "The day you sold me," Britney said quietly, "you decided I was no longer your family. Today I'm simply honoring your decision." She nodded to Marcus, who stepped forward to escort a sobbing Vanessa off the property, her pleas fading down the long drive until the gates finally closed behind her for good. In the months that followed, Britney and Luke expanded the foundation her father had once dreamed of building, funding scholarships in his name and opening shelters for young women who'd survived exactly what she had. Luke's empire, rebuilt without David Mercer's betrayal or Arthur Kane's shadow, grew stronger than it had ever been under fear alone, because now it was built on something fear could never manufacture: trust. Standing on the balcony that evening, the city lights spread beneath her like something finally within reach. Britney leaned into her husband's side and understood at last that the greatest revenge had never been wealth or power. It had been becoming a woman no one could ever own again. The girl who had once been traded like property had become the only woman the most feared man in America trusted with his heart, his empire, and his future.